We're going to start at OregonHistoryProject.org and a page entitled Snake River Massacre account by one of the survivors. And what I thought was, instead of reading a translation of the article, which I couldn't find, we'll read the actual newspaper article. This is from the Oregon Argus, November 24th, 1860. The Snake River Massacre, an account by one of the survivors. It's dated November 10th, 1860. The survivors of the Snake River Massacre arrived at Walla Walla last week. 12 in number, namely Mr. Myers, wife and 5 children, Mrs. Chase and child, Miss Trimble, Mr. Munson, and Mr. Chaffee. Joseph and Jacob Wright came in some time ago to the Umatilla Reservation, and Schneider, who was the first to get in. The last is the man who came in on Willow Creek. His story was very contradictory and did not agree with the facts as afterward developed. Of 44 immigrants, only 15 are known to be saved. 4 children, 3 girls, 1 boy, are supposed to have been taken prisoners by the Indians. One of the girls was 14 or 15, one was 12, and the others were younger. All the others were either killed or have died of starvation. Mr. M. Myers of Salem went out to meet his brothers and found them on Grand Ronde River. The immigrants, Mr. Myers and family, came down from Walla Walla on the steamer last trip on their way to Salem with their brother. From them I obtained the following answers to questions which I asked. From this report you can draw your own conclusions of the whole affair, nearly as well as if you had heard it yourself. The train consisted of 8 wagons and was from Wisconsin, excepting the Chase family, who were from Geneva, Illinois, and the Wright boys from Minnesota. They left the Missouri River June 5th, and they were not molested by Indians until the time of the massacre. The discharged soldiers joined us at Fort Hall. 5 of them were regularly discharged, and 1 was a deserter named Chaffee. The 5 discharged all had money or checks, and some got their checks cashed at Camp Floyd. They each had between $400 and $700. But Schneider did not get his cashed. I think he already had coin, and I hear it said he had plenty when he got in. Those in the train were as follows. Joseph Myers, wife and 5 children, the latter from 1 to 10 years old. His brother John Myers, single man. Elijah Utter, wife and 10 children, 3 of which were his wife's by a former marriage. Their name Trimble, and aged as follows. Discharged soldiers who joined at Fort Hall. Murdoch, Schneider, Schamberg, looks like Keinel, and Utley, and Chaffee the deserter, who gave himself up at Walla Walla, a total of 44. The train was attacked some 90 miles beyond Owyhee River, September 8th, about 350 miles beyond Walla Walla. The Indians first attempted to stampede the stock, but did not succeed. The train immediately corralled for defense, having a favorable position, but no water. The Indians, finding they could accomplish nothing, threw down their arms and made friendly signs, came up and made signs for something to eat. Of them we fed many. They appeared to be satisfied, and made signs for us to go on to the water, that they were friendly, so we started for the river. After we got out of our strong position, they commenced upon us, but we expected some kind of treachery and were on the lookout for them. Before we got corralled and our cattle chained, 2 of our men were shot down, Utley and Lawson. The attack commenced about 10 a.m. and lasted until the night of the 9th. 2 or more of our men were killed, Kitchnell and Judson Cracy. It was very warm weather, and we all nearly were famished for water. So we hitched up. We left 4 wagons and considerable things in them, thinking that would satisfy them. We were compelled to go to the water somehow. We had been hemmed up there 2 days and 1 night without a drop, and the cattle were getting very uneasy. The loose stock had been driven off by the Indians, but we still had our teams tied on the inside of the corral. What we left to the Indians did not seem to satisfy them at all. While they had us hemmed up, we killed not less than 25 or 30 of them. It was certain death to an Indian if he showed his head, for we were all pretty good marksmen, and there were too many for us. The Indians would come right up to the wagons, cut holes in the covers, and shoot their arrows in at the women and children. But few of those who were so bold as to thus come up got away without getting a shot. I have a little bit better resolution here. Charles Utler, a lad, shot 5 Indians as fast as he could load and shoot. He was in the hindmost wagon. Mr. Utter got wounded and could do nothing. We hitched up and started about sundown, but the cattle were so hungry we could hardly get them along. They would keep biting and reaching at every spear of grass. We mounted 4 men on horses, Murdoch, Schamberg, Schneider, and Chaffee, the deserter. The 2 Reith boys on foot. The object of having these 6 men ahead was to keep the road open and keep the Indians from closing in ahead, while we could get our wagons and families along. The Indians pitched in on all sides, and these men, instead of staying and helping us, put off as fast as they could go, without firing a shot, and left us to our fate. The Indians had a few guns and plenty of arrows. If those men had stayed with us, I believe we could have got through to water, and then we could have defended ourselves till we could get assistance. We kept going along as fast as we could, fighting our way. It was getting dark. Our help weakened, cattle hungry, slow traveling. My brother John Myers was driving the team, and I was walking, with my gun and revolver, when I saw an Indian rise up behind a big sagebrush. A big sage bush, and level his piece at one of us. I raised mine, but his gun went off first, and my brother fell dead without a struggle. The next instant I fired, and the Indian gave a whoop, jumped up, and fell dead. Mr. Utter attempted to treat with them, and made signs that they might have all, if they would only spare our lives, but to no purpose. Mrs. Utter, 2 daughters, and a little son refused to leave their wounded parent. They stopped with him, and the presumption is they were killed outright. We concluded to leave everything and go on foot, as so many of our men were now gone and disabled that we could not get the teams along and protect ourselves at the same time. Mary Utter was in my wagon, and just as I was helping her out, a shot passed through my coat, just grazing the skin. The ball went into her breast when she fell, but got up again and cried, "Oh my God, I'm shot," and called on some of the men to help her. 2 young men took hold of her and helped her along a little way when she commenced sinking and was getting helpless, so they had to leave her. She was about 23 years old. I helped my family out of the wagon, and we all went on as fast as we could, traveling all night. We could see fires behind us, and supposed there must have been wagons burning. We laid by in the daytime and traveled at night, all afoot, and nothing to eat except 1 loaf of bread that Mr. Chase took out of the wagon. We were well armed, and an Indian dare and an Indian dare not show his head. They would not attack us in the night, and they were afraid to come about us in the daytime. My wife carried the baby, about a year old, until she almost gave out. And I, the next one. The others had to walk. The Indians followed us for 4 days, but did not come in gunshot, but kept up yelling and whooping. It seems as though they meant to haunt us all the time, but they did not trouble us after that, except to get on the hills and roll rocks down toward us. Finally, they gave up the chase and let us alone. We had nothing to eat, so we killed one of 2 dogs which followed us, and roasted and ate him. A few days later, we ate the other dog. We caught fish in the streams when we could, sometimes with pretty good luck. Some days not. We would eat rosebuds and berries when we could get them. We ate snakes, lizards, and frogs, and mussels out of the streams. Sometimes shot ducks and geese. And if the Indians had not afterward robbed us of our guns, we could have made a living by killing game, which was tolerably plenty, where we camped on the Wahi River. A wild cow came along. We made out to shoot her, and that lasted some time. We traveled in this way some 8 or 9 days, and were entirely given out when we got to Wahi River. So we stopped, and made us a house of willows and grass. We piled a lot of grass inside. We crawled into the hut at night, but we had no blankets, and but little clothing. It was about the 17th of September when we stopped. We had then gone about 90 miles. There we stopped until Captain Dent's party came, which was about the 25th of October, which makes that about 47 days from the time of the attack until Captain Dent came up. After we had been in camp on the Oahe about 3 weeks, the Van Norman family concluded to leave and travel on as well as they could. They got together what provisions they could and started. They refused to allow Miss Trimble to go with them. That is the last we heard of the Van Norman family until Captain Dent's party came. They found the Van Norman family on Burnt River, all murdered, apparently but a few days away. Captain Dent found all the bodies, excepting those of 4 children. The girls and 1 boy. The eldest girl was... can't read it. It is supposed that they were taken prisoner, and probably are yet alive. The bodies... were brutally beaten and scored with knives, and the arms of the women were tied. While in camp, after the Van Normans left, we kept alive by hunting everything we could. The Indians would bring salmon to trade for any little thing we could spare, such as needles, pins, the rags on our backs, until we were reduced to a state of nakedness. Mr. Chase ate too hearty a meal one day of salmon, which threw him into hiccups. He died one night, we knew not when, and we buried him the next day. After we had sold everything, the Indians refused to bring any more salmon unless we would give them our guns, which we did not wish to do, but they were determined to have them. So I buried my revolver and ammunition. The Indians took the guns and gave us what salmon they pleased, and promised more, which they never brought. One of the Trimble boys volunteered to go home with the Indians, and do what he could to induce them to bring provisions to us. They used him very kindly, fed him, and gave him a place to sleep. He, in company with some of the Indians, would come over to the camp every few days and bring salmon. One day someone happened to mention soldier in the conversation. The Indians at once seemed to understand the word. They straightened up and murmured soja, soja, the word passing from one to the other, and a curious devilish look seemed to pervade their countenance. They went off, the boy following them, but he never returned. We waited, but no word from him. Not an Indian after that made any appearance. They had been camped some 3 miles below across the river. I went down one day opposite the place and saw a few wigwams, but no sign of any Indians. On the way back, I saw where something had been dragged across the path. I followed up the trace, hoping it might be where some animal had dragged along a deer, and I might find a piece to take home. But I found nothing except a lock of human hair, which I took home, and which was recognized as the boy's. Captain Dent followed up this sign and found other body parts, indicating that the boy had been dispatched. On my way home that day, I found the carcass of a horse that the wolves had deserted. I picked up a shank and took it to camp, and you may guess there was but little meat on it when the coyotes left it. We used that whole carcass. We burnt the bones and ate them, and the skins we roasted. When we could find a piece of carcass, we made use of it. We were getting so weak that we could scarcely walk about. We ate weeds, grass, anything at all we could find. Starvation was staring us in the face. Finally, one of the children died. Mrs. Chase just lost all her children but one. Some Indians came along one day and dug up Mr. Chase's body for the few rags it had on. Really? We made up our minds to try and eat him. But before we began roasting, Captain Dent and party came along, just in time to save us from that awful meal. We saved every one of our children, and Mrs. Chase might have saved hers if she had not been so selfish. She lived too well herself and starved her child. She would scold my wife because we gave our children so much. She argued that we were all bound to die right there, and that it was better that the children should die first than for us to die and leave our children to the mercy of the wolves. But my wife said she believed that Providence would yet deliver us, and that we should all try to keep alive as long as possible. This goes on, but it soon gets illegible. And I could find no translation of it, so right now, as far as I know, this is the only source of this story. Unless maybe you go and photograph the microfilm yourself. I guess. Let's check out some art.
No, sir, I'm staying right here.
Where's the girl?
Here's the car.
Come on.
There's candies and peanuts. You ain't got no answer for that one, have you? There's your funny bones going back on you, eh? 12! Cigars, candies, and peanuts.
Here's one massacre you ain't survived.
At grunge.com, we have a short description of cholera on an epidemic scale. And the author says cholera is one of those old-timey diseases you definitely don't want. And it was a huge problem for a very gross reason, especially in the floodplain around the Platte River and the Platte River crossing. Let's talk about why in the least gross way possible, writes the author. The river crossing was massively dangerous, according to Wyoming history. It was made safer but more expensive by the Mormon ferries that were set up in 1847. Even as they started ferrying wagons across, they found they could not keep up. Dozens of wagons were lined up waiting for their turn to cross. Those who didn't wait tended to drown in the full view of others. Talk about incentive. By 1850, the area was swimming with cholera. There were a few reasons for it, and Brian Altonen says part of the problem was the saline alkaline waters of the Platte, being the perfect breeding ground for cholera left behind in settlers' waste products. Historian Aaron Smith notes that the later settlers left, the more susceptible to cholera they would be, mostly because you were following in the footsteps of people who were essentially excreting cholera as they went. Leaving late, you'd be waiting on the shores of a river where people and animals have been doing their business for months and months, and yes, you were drinking that water too. You had no idea the decision to ferry or ford the river was so gross, did you? Writes the author. And then here at history.nebraska.gov is an article entitled Crossing the Platte, the Meanest of Rivers. And the author begins, "This is our experience crossing the Platte River, the meanest of rivers. Broad, shallow, fishless, snakeful, quicksand bars and muddy water. The stage rumbles over the bottom like on a bed of rock, yet haste must be made to effect a crossing, else you disappear beneath its turbid waters, and your doom is certain." This from an 1862 diary, quoted in the Great Platte River Road. The author Merrill Matz writes that some travelers referred to the coast of the Platte because the broad river on its sandy bed looked almost like an ocean shoreline in the distance. He quotes a traveler named James Evans who saw the river swollen with spring rains and snowmelt. Quote, "From the sandhills, it had the appearance of a great inland sea. It looked wider than the Mississippi. Judge my surprise when I learned it was only 3 or 4 feet deep. The water is exceedingly muddy, or I should say sandy, and what adds greatly to the singular appearance of this river. The water is so completely filled with glittering particles of mica, or isinglass, that its shining waves look to be rich with floating gold." Is that it for that? That's it for that. And then there's one here at wyominghistory.org or wyohistory.org by the staff at Wyo History, entitled Crossing the North Platte River. Immigrants bound for Oregon, California, and Utah in the mid-1800s faced high tolls and high risks when they crossed the North Platte River near present Casper, Wyoming. River crossings were extremely dangerous. Operators of commercial ferries and bridges charged steep prices for safety. Many immigrants, unwilling or unable to pay, cobbled together other more homemade solutions with varying success. Until bridges were built, nearly all travelers swam their livestock across, and many people and animals were drowned in the swift, deep, shockingly cold water of the Platte. From what's now central Nebraska, to South Pass in west central Wyoming. Travelers to California, Oregon, and Utah all took more or less one route. Most came up the south side of the Platte from Fort Kearney, crossed the South Platte, where the river forks in western Nebraska, and continued west up the south side of the North Fork. This meant fording the Laramie River, where it joined the North Platte at Fort Laramie, and finally crossing the North Platte itself, 150 miles later, where the river bent to the south near present Casper. After that, travelers could continue on to the west. Well, look at that, will you? They built a barge, or is that one of the ferries? That's one of the ferries. Holds 2 wagons. Check this out. With their animals tied to the sides. That would be more economical to take 2 at a time. And I bet they gouge those prices too. During fur trade times, in the 1820s and 30s, many travelers crossed at Red Butte, west of present Casper. In the early and mid-1840s, wagon train emigrants began crossing at a variety of places along 25 miles of river from the mouth of Deer Creek at present-day Glen Rock, Wyoming, all the way to Casper. Many made small boats by emptying their wagons, removing the wagon box from the running gear, caulking the boxes watertight with tar, dismantling the running gear into pieces, and then ferrying everything across the water in the wagon boxes, using poles or oars for guidance, and often using oxen or human power to tow the craft across the water with long ropes. This was a fairly reliable method, but due to the unloading, dismantling, and reloading, it was very slow. Big cottonwood trees were plentiful. Some of the earliest travelers made simple rafts of cottonwood logs lashed together, which they pulled or rowed across. These were unwieldy and dangerous. Soon emigrants figured out how to hollow out cottonwood logs and make dugout canoes, 20 foot long or more, by lashing together 3 canoes, or lashing a canoe on either side of a log in the middle. Emigrants found they could make a stable boat of the right width, so that a wagon's wheels could rest inside the 2 outermost canoes. The Mormon Ferry. By the middle of June 1847, the first Mormon pioneer party, bound for Salt Lake Valley, experimented with wagon box boats and rafts before building a stout ferry out of cottonwood dugouts and a pine pole deck. Even Church President Brigham Young stripped himself and went to work with all his strength. It is written in the diary of Thomas Bullock. As they were finishing up, they found 108 wagons from other parties, stretched over 4 miles and all wanting to cross the river, wrote Mormon diarist Norton Jacob. A practical solution suggested itself. 10 Mormon men stayed behind to run the ferry for the rest of the emigration season. They were directed to charge non-Mormons $3 cash, or $1.50 worth of flour or other provisions, at Iowa or Missouri prices, to cross 1 wagon and 1 family. The men were to keep a just and accurate account, and to make the returns of the proceeds of their labor to the authorities of the church, and also to cross the brethren, that is, the Mormon emigrants expected to arrive later in the summer, and charge such as they are able to pay, a reasonable price, to be determined by the council that shall come with the camp. End quote. This Mormon ferry, as it came to be known, was the first commercial ferry at the upper crossing of the Platte. operating about where the bridge on Wyoming Boulevard crosses now between Casper and its suburb of Mills in Wyoming. All wagon trains traveled with a large number of animals. Loaded wagons moved best when pulled by 3 yoke of oxen. 6 animals per wagon. Oh, 3 yokes are 6 animals. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, because they're yoked together, right? Yoke, okay. 6 animals per wagon meant a train of 25 wagons needed daily grass and water for 150 cattle, plus any other mules, saddle horses, or milk cows making the trip. Moving the animals across the river proved to be the trickiest part of all. The Platte, at its upper crossings, then and now, was 100 to 200 yards wide and more than 10 feet deep at the deepest point. Transcontinental emigrants who were on schedule crossed in June, when the water at its height from the spring runoff was moving smooth and fast. Because ferries charged a fee for each animal as well as for the wagons, there was a strong incentive for immigrants to swim their livestock across. Account after account tells of one or two brave men in the party on horse or muleback leading the herd into the water. At the point where the river gets deep enough that the animal has to swim, the person does as well, often without warning. Time and again, travelers in their diaries tell of animals plunging in, trying to cross, losing their footing, and being driven half a mile or more downstream, only to emerge on the same side. The work exhausted the crossers, and drownings were common every June, and stock died by the hundreds. Let's check out some art.
The Lone Ranger rides again.
Come on, Silver! We're heading for the Oregon Trail.
The pioneer trail to Oregon was a dangerous trail. Whoever rode it faced miles of lonely country, where marauding bands of Indians swept down from the barren hills, where bad men and buzzards waited to attack the weary traveler. Along the wagon tracks, the broken remains of burnt wheels and the tattered canvas that once covered prairie schooners were mute evidence, a constant warning to all who passed. Beware. Keep your eyes sharp and your guns loaded. There's danger on the Oregon Trail.
Mighty risky taking the Oregon Trail by your lonesome. Why don't you wait until you can join up with the wagon train?
Shucks, I've been sitting for a month now. I'm tired of waiting. If I wait any longer, I won't never get to Oregon.
What about Indians and outlaws?
Oh, Indians and outlaws. I'm a good hand with a rifle. I can handle trouble.
Lance Kennard shot his way out of a posse. When last seen, he was riding by his horse northwest from Long Meadow using a whip and spur.
It's Kennard.
And sakes alive, what's troubling you two men? Is something wrong?
Well, Senator, thanks for the advice, but I don't think I'll take it. It ain't one chance in 1,000 I'd ever meet up with that hombre.
Meet up with who?
Never mind, Martha. Come on, up you come.
And about time, too.
We're heading west, and we ain't going to stop till we get to Oregon. Goodbye. Bye, everybody. Here we go.
The ranger and Tonto headed northwest toward the Oregon Trail in search of Lance Kennard and Wellman. They moved slowly.
Who is that hombre? He gives me the willies. He's got his hands at his sides and he's walking his horse.
Yeah, I see him.
Should I shoot, pick him off?
No, never mind the rifle. Let him come. He's alone.
All right, mister, that's close enough. I said that's enough. Stand there.
Kennard, might as well give up right now.
Nobody takes Lance Kennard. Nobody.
Look at his eyes behind that mask.
Stop that gun, Wellman. Stop it.
Don't come any closer, mister. I'm warning you.
Kennard, you're a gunfighter. You're a bully and a coward. I'm calling you, Kennard.
Nobody can talk to me like that.
I'm talking to you like that. I'm calling you, Kennard. Reach for your guns.
I'll kill you.
Reach for your guns.
You can't bluff me. All right, I will draw. Oh, my hand.
What about you, Wellman?
No. I got my hands up high, mister. You shot the gun right out of Lance's fist. I'm coming peaceable.
Here at yohistory.org, we have another reading. This is written by Annette Hine. and it's entitled Journey to Martin's Cove, the Mormon Handcart Tragedy of 1856. In August of 1856, in Florence, Nebraska Territory, 2 emigrant companies of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, nearly 1,100 people, led by Captain James Willey and Captain Edward Martin, left the Missouri River to start a late-season crossing of the plains. The Willey Company left Florence on August 17th. The Martin Company on August 27th. Families pushed and pulled 2-wheeled, shallow-boxed handcarts. In other words, they had no draft animals. They were their own draft animals. They carried their belongings in carts. Built out of green lumber a short time before, the hot sun and wind were hard on the immigrants and the handcarts. After a few weeks, the green wood began to shrink and crack. Poorly greased wooden wheels shrieked on their wooden axles. 4 months later, the survivors reached Utah Territory. On the way, more than 200 of the emigrants died, crossing what's now Wyoming as winter set in. The 1856 emigrants were British and Scandinavian converts en route to the new Mormon homeland in Utah. The first Mormons had arrived there and founded Salt Lake City 9 years earlier. After a decade and a half of increasingly violent persecution in New York, Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois. By the early 1850s, most American Mormons had already arrived in Utah, and the church began actively seeking converts in Europe. Church leaders organized a smooth transit system involving chartered steamships, riverboats up the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, and later railroad passage from the East Coast to central Iowa. Many emigrants' passage was supported by the church. In the mid-1850s, however, drought and famine struck Utah, and suddenly there was not nearly as much wealth in the church to support incoming travelers. To save money and time, church leaders in 1856 urged emigrants to use hand carts. The carts were far cheaper than wagons and oxen teams, and people pulling hand carts could move more quickly when they did not have to wait daily for their livestock to graze. The hand carts consisted almost entirely of green lumber and had been built in Iowa by the immigrants themselves. They were shallow, 3 feet wide and 5 feet long, and they held skimpy supplies of food, plus 17 pounds of luggage, clothes, blankets, and personal possessions for each person. 17 pounds of luggage for each person. A few ox-drawn wagons accompanied the party to carry tents, more food, and the sick. Rations were 1 pound of flour per person daily, plus any meat that was shot on the way. The carts were pulled by 1 or 2 people, while other family members pushed behind or walked alongside. 3 smaller handcart companies had already crossed the plains to Utah, quickly and successfully that year, with the help of supply wagons coming out of Salt Lake City. The crucial difference between these crossings and those of Willey and Martin companies was the timing. Problems of a late crossing. Levi Savage, a sub-captain in the Willey Company, wrote in his journal that he warned the party before they left Florence of the hardships that we should have to endure. Quote, I said that we were liable to have to wade in the snow up to our knees, and should at night wrap ourselves in a thin blanket and lie on the frozen ground without a bed. The lateness of the season was my only objection of leaving this point for the mountains at this time. End quote. However, Savage's advice was ignored. He explains, quote, Brother Wiley exhorted the saints to go forward regardless of suffering, even unto death. And Savage was later reprimanded for the wrong impression by expressing myself so freely. End quote. The weather stayed warm. The two companies were traveling about 2 weeks apart. As the Martin Company reached what's now Wyoming, food and supplies were running low. To help speed the party, the captain ordered his company to reduce personal baggage from 17 pounds per person to 10 pounds per person. Many people left heavy clothes and bedding, which were then burned so nobody could smuggle unauthorized items back into their carts. Sometime in late summer, supply convoys from Salt Lake City were sent east, but they failed to meet the immigrants. Records are sketchy and the reason is still unclear. It appears that these supply trains, after waiting some time for the expected handcarters, turned back when the immigrants did not show up. But in early October, a party of fast-traveling missionaries returning to Utah from Europe, who had passed the Willie and Martin companies on the trails, arrived in Salt Lake City and reported that the two large handcart parties were still on the way. Church President Brigham Young and his counselors immediately set relief parties in wagons, well stocked with extra food, to find the latecomers and bring them in. On October 19th, the Martin Company crossed the North Platte River near present Casper, Wyoming, where the trail left the river headed across country toward Independence Rock and Devil's Gate. That day, a winter storm struck. The water was shallow, but the river was wide and freezing cold. Quote, we had to travel in our wet clothes until we got to camp, immigrant Patience Loader wrote later. And our clothing was frozen on us when we got to camp. It was too late to go for wood. And it was too late to go for wood and water. The wood was too far away. That night the ground was frozen too hard. We were unable to drive any tent pins in. We stretched it open the best we could and got under it until morning. Meanwhile, the rescuers were traveling east. On October 19th, they found the stalled and starving Willie camp in the snow on the Sweetwater River near South Pass. Half the rescue party stayed with the Willie Company. The other half pushed on. And 9 days later, 3 scouts for the rescue party found the Martin Company about 100 miles further east at Red Butte on the North Platte. In the 9 days since the freezing river crossing, the Martin Company, exhausted and nearly out of food in the bitter cold, had moved only a few miles. One of the scouts later noted that 56 people in the Martin Company died during those 9 days. Here's their carts right here. Check this out. Designed to be pulled rather than pushed, I guess. And the kids don't even get to ride. I guess unless they're sick. Rescuer Ephraim Hanks later wrote, the starved forms and haggard countenances of the poor sufferers as they moved about slowly, shivering with cold, to prepare their scanty evening meal, was enough to touch the stoutest heart. They hailed me with joy inexpressible. There was only 1 day's quarter rations left in camp. So they were down to their last day of rations, which was quarter rations. Hanks and the other 2 scouts got the Martin Company moving again 60 more miles to Devil's Gate. There, the rest of the rescuers waited for them at some abandoned traders' cabins called the Seminole Fort. Exhaustion, exposure, and lack of food had weakened the emigrants of both the Willie and Martin companies, and many died even after rescue efforts had begun. The Martin Company camped for several days in a small cove in the rocks that must have given some shelter from the wind, a mile or two east up the Sweetwater from Devil's Gate. They still had very little food. 2 small Mormon wagon trains that had been traveling close behind the large Handcart company, meanwhile, arrived at Devil's Gate about the same time. The people with these trains were also in bad shape and nearly out of food, though better off than the handcarters. Besides personal belongings, the smaller trains were also carrying commercial freight bound for Utah. A solution became obvious. Empty these trains of most of their goods. Leave the goods behind at the trader cabins. Abandon the handcarts and give the weakest members of the Martin Company a ride the rest of the way. 20 men stayed at Devil's Gate to guard the wagon train goods for the rest of the winter. With the help of more rescue parties sent east, the Willie Company finally reached Salt Lake on November the 9th, and the Martin Company 21 days later, on November 30th. A modern historian counted 67 deaths in the Willie Company at a rate of about 14%, and between 135 and 150 in the Martin Company at a rate of about 25% of the company's members. It was by far the worst non-military disaster on the emigrant trail. Of the 60,000 or so emigrants who traveled to Utah, across what is now Wyoming, before the completion of the Union Pacific Railroad in 1869, about 3,000 used handcarts. Still, the image of a pioneer family pulling a handcart has become a symbol central to the Mormon Church's sense of the power of its faith. Yeah, the power of its faith killed a lot of people too. Just saying. Editor's note for an account of the recent controversy over who should own the land at Martin's Cove, click here. Okay, maybe later. There's that picture.
In 1856, Brigham Young received word of a group of Latter-day Saints stuck on the plains and in need of assistance. This letter and the response has become known as the Handcart Rescue. Do you want to summarize for us a little bit about what that was?
In 1856, a group of handcart pioneers, a couple of companies, the Willie Company and the Martin Company, along with their supporting wagon company, got stuck in an early winter snowstorm. And because of that snowstorm and the lack of food with the company, they were both starving to death and freezing to death. They had abandoned some of their clothing along the way in order to lighten their loads, and at this point they realized a mistake had been made with that as well. So when the word got to Salt Lake City that these companies were stuck on the plains, Brigham Young immediately called people together in conference and told them to stop meeting and get out there and start acting to assist these people. So members of the church began to take their clothing, their food, their teams and their horses and send them out to these parties of people who needed rescuing out on the plains, and they brought many of them in safely.
And this is really a heroic rescue, right? There are people, the rescuers are putting their own lives in danger to do this.
It did require unselfishness on the part of the people who provided the supplies, and it particularly required sacrifice on the part of the people who went out, because they were out in an area where if they got in trouble, they might lose their lives themselves.
In 1857, Brigham Young got another letter, this time from southern Utah, saying a group of immigrants were passing through the area, and they wanted to know what Brigham Young thought they should do about it. Brigham Young responded immediately and said, "Let them go, don't do anything." Events continued to spiral, and this became the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Can you tell us a little bit more about the massacre?
In this case, there was a period of war. And those war tensions caused otherwise good people in southern Utah to begin to behave in a way exactly opposite to how they behaved in Salt Lake the year before. Instead of trying to help these immigrants who were passing through, they reacted in a way that ultimately led to a disaster, to the massacring of 120 men, women, and children under a white flag. It was the worst event in the history of Utah. And it was the result of this downward spiraling that occurred when they first began to treat these immigrants as the other and not as human beings to be treated with respect. And that led to a result that was absolutely unthinkable. People couldn't understand why they did what they did. And mass killings like the Mount Meadows Massacre generally follow a particular pattern. That pattern includes listening to rumors about people that later turn out not to be true. So I think there's a lesson to be learned in that. Rather than listen to rumors about people who are different from ourselves and assume that those rumors are true, we ought to dismiss them and react with a sense of unselfishness.
And this is the same group of people that had themselves been sufferers of persecution. They knew what it was like to be other, and yet they reacted in this negative way.
That was the great irony. Instead of reacting as people who had been persecuted, knowing how to help other people who needed assistance, they reacted in the way their persecutors had reacted. The result was not only an individual disaster, but also a community disaster, kind of community guilt. I think we need to grieve for those who died senselessly in the Mount Meadows Massacre. We need to remember them. We need to honor them.
Here at Wikipedia is a story about the Grattan Massacre. The Grattan Massacre, also known as the Grattan Fight, was the opening engagement of the First Sioux War. Fought between the U.S. Army and the Lakota Sioux warriors on August 19, 1854. It occurred east of Fort Laramie, Nebraska Territory, in present-day Goshen County, Wyoming. A small detachment of soldiers entered a large Sioux encampment to arrest a man accused of taking a migrant's cow, although such matters by treaty were to be handled by the U.S. Indian agent. After one of the soldiers fatally shot Chief Malto Wayuhi, Conquering Bear, the Sikchanju Lakotas returned fire and killed 29 soldiers, Lieutenant John Grattan, and a civilian interpreter. The massacre, as it was called by the American press, is considered an early and significant event in the Plains Indian Wars. And the picture here, let's open that in a new tab. Gives all the details in short order. Sioux Indians massacred 29 soldiers with their officer, Second Lieutenant Grattan. An Indian killed a cow from a Mormon caravan. The detachment of soldiers was sent to receive the offender. In the ensuing fight, all soldiers and the chief of the Sioux were killed. Here's background. Events. Let's go to events. By the time the detachment reached the encampment, Auguste was intoxicated from drinking along the way, as he feared the encounter. Grattan broke his bottle and scolded him. Auguste was not well liked by the Sioux. He spoke only broken Dakota and had little grasp of other dialects. As they entered the encampment, he began to taunt the Sioux, calling their warriors women, and saying the soldiers were not there to talk, but to kill them all. James Bordeaux, who owned the nearby trading post and observed the encounter, later recounted Auguste's comments. Historians estimate the encampment had some 1,200 warriors, among the total 4,800 population, so 25% of the population was warriors, and they were there. According to Bordeaux, Lieutenant Grattan began to realize the risk. He stopped to discuss the situation with the trader. Bordeaux advised him to talk directly with Conquering Bear and let him handle the situation. Grattan seemed to understand and continued on into the encampment. Going first to the lodge of High Forehead, he ordered him to surrender to U.S. forces. High Forehead said he would die first. Grattan went to Conquering Bear, saying the Sioux should arrest the guilty party and turn him over. Conquering Bear refused, but tried to negotiate, offering a horse as compensation for the cow. Bordeaux reportedly said the interpreter Auguste taunted the Sioux and failed to fully or accurately translate Conquering Bear and Grattan's comments, as there seemed to be confusion between them. Conquering Bear asked for the trader Bordeaux to act as interpreter, as the Sioux trusted him and his language ability. Called by the Sioux, Bordeaux rode to the meeting place. Later, he said he could see the situation was out of hand. As Grattan pressed Conquering Bear, numerous Sioux warriors moved into flanking positions around the soldiers. Bordeaux returned to the trading post, where he told associates to arm themselves as a fight was brewing. Ending the discussion, Grattan began walking back to his column. A nervous soldier fired his gun, shooting a Sioux. The warriors started shooting arrows, while leaders tried to take control. Conquering Bear was mortally wounded and died 9 days later near the Niobrara River. The Sioux warriors, led by Spotted Tail, then a rising war chief within their people, quickly killed Grattan. 11 of his men and the interpreter. the drunk interpreter. No great loss there. A group of some 18 soldiers retreated on foot, trying to reach some rocks for defense. But they were cut off and killed by overcoming warriors led by Red Cloud, who is pictured here. A rising war chief with the Oglala Sioux. One soldier survived the massacre, but later died of his wounds. Conquering Bear was the only Lakota Sioux who was killed. The Sioux spared Bordeaux, both because he was married to a Sioux woman and because he had a friendly relationship with the tribes. Let's check out some art.
It's it, the big one!
I'm all right. I thought you...
Sometimes it don't pay to think.
I killed a man, an Indian. I saw him fall.
I needed was a chance.
There's more in them graves than just people.
Here at littlethings.com is a story by Grace Eyre, entitled 10 Things You Probably Didn't Know About the Oregon Trail. And Grace begins. Before the American West was what we know and love today, our foremothers and forefathers had to travel out there in wagons and settle it. The path along the Oregon Trail was certainly not an easy one, nor was it short. Can you imagine living back in the 1840s or 50s and having to make the decision about whether or not you wanted to take your family on this arduous journey? Disease and death were both very real possibilities for those who chose to take the course. But for many, it was the only feasible option left for a decent life. A little explanation for that would be nice. I don't think I would ever have been able to handle things on the Oregon Trail. The diet alone would be so hard to follow. Well, it's kind of like Survivor. That's all you get. So I don't think it would have been so hard to follow it. The diet's probably the easiest part. You eat what you get. But the families in the 1800s didn't have a choice if they wanted to start a new life, where they would have a chance to prosper. So these are 10 things you probably didn't know. Number 1, it was not just one path. It was more like an open-ended course. The prairie was expensive and unsettled, and each pioneer had to choose his or her own destiny. It involved a lot of freedom, but that freedom sometimes resulted in dire consequences. Pioneers could never be completely sure they were making the right choice. Right. Well, you didn't go out on... They're talking about different choices by wagon trains, not different choices by the wagons themselves, I'm sure. Number 2, it stretched about 2,000 miles. While there were many divergent paths to take, the entirety of the journey stretched for about 2,000 miles. That's quite a ways to travel in such harsh condition. Thank you, Captain Obvious. It took a half a year to complete, sorry. It took 1/2 year to complete. According to Frontier Trails, pioneers traveling about 15 miles per day would get to their destination in about 4 to 6 months. Pioneers would ideally leave around May and finish sometime around October. The problem was that if you left too soon, you might get bogged down in mud, and if you took too long on the path, you might have trouble with snow. Picking mules or oxen was a big decision, it says here. This picture is entitled The Ox and Cow Team. That guy looks pretty old. There's his traveling companion, a dog. And there's maybe 1 cow and 1 ox here, maybe? Mules, unlike oxen, responded to commands and training. They also came pretty cheap, which was a major decision-making factor in those times. Mules also responded to their names and the tone or emotion in the voice of the human directing them. That said, the mule and its driver had to develop at least a bit of a relationship over the 2,000 miles in order to get there smoothly. Oxen were much stronger, but they were also much slower. If you had a heavy wagon, an ox might be a better choice in case you needed to get unstuck from mud or travel up a big hill. What grade level is this written at? I'm thinking 4th, maybe 3rd, maybe 2nd. The trail was scattered with litter. According to Nebraska studies, folks embarking on the Oregon Trail often overpacked. Salespeople would sell pioneers certain necessities that travelers would end up ditching along the trail, littering the path to the west with tents, cooking supplies, shoes, beds, you name it. No, why don't you name it, since you did barely any research for this article. Rain spelled big trouble because it meant mud and rising rivers. Water could rise around riverbeds, turning the surrounding areas into quicksand that could potentially swallow a wagon, a person, or an animal in a matter of minutes. What is that? A pile of mud, maybe? They used buffalo chips to cook. Since the path was pretty much devoid of timber, travelers had to use buffalo chips to fuel the fires for their meals. Yeah, this is like 2nd grade reading level or so. Between 2nd and 3rd, maybe. Crossing a river was the most dangerous possible feat. Let's check out some art.
If you were here in February of 1851, you would have witnessed one of the most violent and brutal massacres in Old West history. That day, 6 people lost their lives, and they lost their lives brutally. Royce Oatman was with a wagon train, and they were heading west, as a lot of different families were. And they were running low on provisions, and they needed to make a shortcut. And everybody in the wagon train, regardless of the problems they were having, said the same thing: don't do it, right? Do not take the chance on going out, because there's savages out there, and you know, they're not going to have a problem doing whatever they want to do. But Roy's made that fateful mistake. Now remember, he had 6 children and one 8.5 months pregnant wife, and they decided to make that journey, that shortcut, cut 6 of their lives that day. The youngest, Mary, she ended up traded to a different tribe, and they actually treated her like one of the family. So that tattoo that's here and here, the 5 markings, a lot of people think that signifies a slave. Those tattoos mean that you'll be able to find your kin in the great world above, right? And the government actually went in and they actually traded for her. It cost them a white stallion because that was a prized possession. But she didn't really want to go. Now, she ended up being 66 years old before she passed in Texas, and she married a rancher, and she had 2 children. She has books out there. You can read about her and her life, because she became a celebrity at that time also because she did have the tattoos on her face and her arms. I'm glad this is here. I'm glad that somebody spent the time to put this here, because this is our history.
Here at legendsofamerica.com is a story entitled Sager Orphans on the Oregon Trail. And the author begins: Henry and Naomi Sager, along with their 6 children, joined a wagon train led by Captain William Shaw at the end of April 1844 in a quest for a better life. The parents would not survive the trip, and the children would suffer more tragedy before their ordeal was complete. Years later, Catherine Sager would describe her father Henry as a restless one. Before 1844, he had moved his growing family 3 times. They started in Virginia, before moving to Ohio, and then Indiana, before finally arriving in Platte County, Missouri, in the autumn of '43. There he engaged in farming and blacksmithing, temporarily settling in St. Joseph, Missouri, a jumping-off point for the Oregon Trail. Henry almost immediately began to make plans. His descendants made the planes. Immediately began to make plans to travel to Oregon. His wife Naomi was reluctant to go at first, but eventually agreed, much to her detriment. In March of 1844, Henry joined a group of pioneers who called themselves the Independent Colony. A month later, the family, including their 6 children, crossed the Missouri River and started out on the 2,000-mile journey along the Oregon Trail. The wagon train included 300 people in 72 covered wagons. After 5 weeks on the trail, Naomi would give birth to their 7th child. On May 30th, in present-day Kansas, they named her Henrietta. Catherine recounted, quote, "The first encampments were a great pleasure to us children. We were 5 girls and 2 boys, ranging from the girl baby to be born on the way to the oldest boy, hardly old enough to be any help." End quote. On July 4th, the wagon train celebrated Independence Day on the banks of the Platte River in Nebraska. A couple of days later, they forded the South Platte River, where Henry Sager lost control of his oxen. The wagon overturned in shallow waters along the bank, and Naomi was injured, but the pioneers pressed on. In late July, they passed Chimney Rock, and here's a picture of it. Chimney Rock in Nebraska. Let's check it out. Interesting. It was a reminder that the Great Plains were almost crossed and the Rocky Mountains lay ahead. Not too far from the north bank of the Platte River, near Fort Laramie, Wyoming, Catherine, age 9, tried to jump out of the wagon while it was in motion. Unfortunately, she caught her dress on an axe handle and was thrown under the wagon. But lucky for her, a doctor who was on the journey saved her leg. But she would be confined to the wagon for the rest of the journey. They pushed on that same night until they reached Fort Laramie. Well, they're lucky they had a doctor on the journey, huh? A couple of days later, the independent colony reached Independence Rock. And on August 23rd, the wagon train reached South Pass on the Continental Divide. During the descent into the Green River Valley, some of the travelers, including Henry Sager, fell ill due to an outbreak of camp fever. After crossing Green River, 2 women and a child had died of the fever, and Henry was very ill. Knowing that death was imminent, he asked Captain Shaw to take care of his family. The next day, he was buried on the banks of the river in an improvised coffin, and the wagon train traveled on. Naomi was torn with grief and was still weakened from childbirth. Although Captain Shaw and the doctor did everything possible to assist her, the exertions were too much, and she too soon fell ill with the fever. After reaching Fort Bridger, Naomi had become delirious and asked the doctor to deliver the children to the Whitman Mission in the Walla Walla Valley in present-day southeastern Washington. She died near present-day Twin Falls, Idaho. In 26 days, the Sager children had lost both parents and were left orphans. The children were cared for by other families in the wagon train, and the caravan pressed on. In early October, word was sent ahead to the mission to let them know that a needy wagon train was approaching and to talk with them about adopting the Sager children. Dr. Marcus Whitman and his wife Narcissa sent word back to the wagon train that they would take all 7 children. A few days later, after 6 months and 2,000 miles, Henry and Naomi Sager's children finally reached their new home in Oregon. In July of the next year, Dr. Whitman obtained a court order giving him legal custody of the children, but tragedy would continue to follow them. The Whitman mission ministered to the Cayuse Indians and had maintained peaceful relations. However, as more and more settlers passed through on wagon trains, disease came with them, striking distrust and animosity among the Indians. The peaceful coexistence of the local Cayuse and the white missionaries was in a delicate balance. And 2 years later, in 1847, the balance began to shift to distrust and animosity. Thus, 3 years after the arrival of the Sager Orphans, an outbreak of measles decimated the Indian tribes of the area, and the Cayuse held white settlers responsible, because, of course, they were. As a result, the Cayuse attacked the Whitman mission in November. Known as the Whitman Massacre, the attack claimed 14 lives at the mission, including Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, and 2 of the Sager boys, John and Frank. So now there's 5 left. The 54 women and children were taken captive and held for ransom. Several of the prisoners died in captivity, mostly from illnesses such as measles, including Louisa Sager. Now they're down to 4. A month after the massacre, Peter Ogden of the Hudson's Bay Company arranged for the release of the women and children by trading blankets, clothing, rifles, and ammo. They were then brought to Fort Vancouver and released into freedom. The 4 remaining Sager girls were split up and sent to different families. Henrietta died young at age 26, supposedly mistakenly killed by an outlaw. The other 3 girls, Catherine, Matilda, and Elizabeth, all married, had children, and lived well into old age. About 1860, Catherine, the oldest girl, wrote a first-hand account of their journey across the plains and their life with the Whitmans. Today, the work entitled Across the Plains in 1844 by Catherine Sager is regarded as one of the most authentic accounts of the American Western migration. Let's check out that art.
Oh, MacDonald had a farm. And on his farm he had a kitty cat. Meow. Oh, MacDonald had a farm. And on his farm he had a kitty cat. Meow. I don't know, are you guys as excited for this next one as I am? Oh, MacDonald had a farm. And on his farm he had a pig. Oink, 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 oink. That was awesome. Oh, MacDonald had a farm. And on his farm he had a donkey. How about these guys give a big round of applause to our fine guys? That was awesome. That was awesome.